سلام، خوش اومدید به 36مین شب از برنامه در این شبها. در دنیایی که ما زندگی میکنیم انبوهی از موجودات وجود دارند که با وجود رو در رویی طولانی مدتی که با اونها داریم اینها به خوبی شناخته نشدن. ما هنوز در برابر شگفتی ها و در جذابیت هایی که محیط زیست اطرافمون فراهم میاره خیلی چیزها رو نمیدونیم و هر از چندگاهی برخی از تحقیقات باعث میشه جنبه های فوق العاده جذابی از این جونورها و دنیای اطرافمون رو ببینیم و شگفت زده بشیم. یکی از این موجوداتی که در طول تاریخ خیلی بد شناخته شده و خیلی در واقع سوء شهرت داره، اگرچه که موجود فوق العاده جذابی، خفاش‌ها هستند. طی یکی دو هفته گذشته خبری منتشر شد مبنی بر اینکه گروهی از محققان موفق شدن روی گونه خاصی از خفاش‌ها کار بکنن، صدای اونها رو بررسی بکنن و متوجه بشن که توله های خفاش‌ها یا در واقع نوزادان خفاش نوعی روند مشابه انسان رو برای یادگیری و توسعه گنجینه صوتی خودشون استفاده میکنن. چیزی که ما در انسان‌ها اصطلاحاً قانون کردن یا ادب کردن میگیم که بچه‌ها با اون روش شروع میکنن به یاد گرفتن صدا و توسعه میدن. این فوق العاده موضوع جذابیه و میتونه نتایج فوق العاده هیجان انگیزی در درک ما از رفتار صوتی حیوانات به خصوص خفاش‌ها رو داشته باشه. برای اینکه در این مورد صحبت کنیم شاید بهترین کسی که میتونست به ما توضیح بده که ارزش این تحقیقات چی است و اساساً این تحقیقات در چه موردیه کسی بود که سرپرستی این تحقیق رو بر عهده داشت، دکتر آنا فرناندز، که لطف کرد و در واقع قبول کردش که امروز با ما صحبت بکنه تا در رابطه با این تحقیق جدیدی که انجام داده ما رو بیشتر در جریان بذاره. دکتر فرناندز در برلین و در موزه علوم طبیعی برلین فعالیت میکنه و به همراه همکارانش این مقاله رو در واقع منتشر کرده بودن. به گفتگوی من با دکتر فرناندز گوش کنید. دکتر فرناندز خیلی ممنون از وقتی که در اختیار ما قرار دادین. شما اخیراً مقاله فوق‌العاده جذابی رو راجع به تحول صوتی خفاش‌ها، گونه خاصی از خفاش‌ها منتشر کردین. اما اجازه بدید قبل از اینکه راجع به اون صحبت کنیم در مورد عامتر تخصص شما صحبت کنیم. شما در رابطه با زبانشناسی جانوری و ارتباطات صوتی در حیوانات کار میکنیم. ما گاهی یادمون میره که این ارتباطات صوتی مخصوص انسان نیست و در بقیه جونورها و حیوانات هم وجود داره. من میخواستم در ابتدا به عنوان یک مقدمه ببینید که ما تا چه اندازه در رابطه با این ارتباطات صوتی در سایر حیوانات خبر داریم و این ارتباطات صوتی در اونها تا چه حد میتونه پیشرفته باشه.
Yeah, well, I think maybe let's start at that point that when we look at human language, there are I call it like three key pillars. We have semantics, we have syntax, and we have signal, so the signal production, the ability to produce sounds. And biolinguistic research focuses on seeing if and to what extent those key features and also other cognitive abilities which are needed for those key features for the three are advanced in other species. And I think there is amazing work done, for example, in signal production. What is very important is vocal learning, vocal imitation, because that's what we need as humans to learn a new language, right? And there is very much known about that in songbirds, for example, amazing work because they are all vocal learners. The males, the young males need to learn the song from adult tutors. There is amazing work in cetaceans. So dolphins are known to be capable of vocal learning. They have also fascinating cognitive abilities because they have individual signature whistles. So they also can address other dolphins, for example, with a specific signature whistle. We know that elephants are also capable of vocal imitation. For example, they can even imitate human sounds. There is this example of the Korean elephant. He was alone, and elephants are social animals, right? So he started to interact with his keeper.
Yeah.
And at some point he was able to imitate Korean sounds. So he was really talking like the keeper. And when the researchers played back his sounds, the elephant sounds and the keeper sounds, people were actually able to understand the elephant, and they didn't know that it was an elephant. So it's amazing.
Wow.
I think. Another fascinating species or taxon are parrots. They are very smart. Maybe you know about the gray parrot, Alex,
yeah.
who is even able, he has even a capacity to think about numbers, and he learned a lot of things. He learned to communicate with humans.
Come on, how many corners? What shape? What shape? Four corner, good boy. How many?
2.
That's right. You're a good boy. No, sweetie. No, you can't go back yet. You gotta.
You want some water?
All right. Do you want some water, or are you just asking to interrupt? Look. What color bigger? What color bigger?
Green.
Green. Oh, you're a good boy.
Yeah, so this is only the signal part, right? So
Yes,
signal
yes,
production,
exactly.
vocal learning. And then we have amazing work in semantics. So I think it's always hard to compare semantics, which is really the meaning of words,
Of course,
to animal species, right? Because we can only infer about the function of vocalization if we observe the vocalization in a certain context, and then maybe we can infer when we see it always happening in the same context, and we can say, oh, that might be a courtship song or a territorial song or whatever. But what a very nice and interesting example are, for example, primates. So there has been done fascinating work by Robert Seyfert and Jenny, and also recent people like Klaus Zuberbühler, or they show that calls can be referential, and I think this is the closest thing to meaning what we can find in animals. So it's a signal which is tied to a certain object or event that's happening. So a very famous example are the calls of vervet monkeys, alarm calls. So if they have 3 different alarm calls for snake, for leopard, I think, and for eagle. And depending on where the danger is, they produce this different sound, and the receivers actually decode that and they react appropriately. And so I think the study about semantics in animals is really fascinating because it gives us an idea about their cognitive abilities. Do they, for example, know that other animals see the world differently, or do they know, for example, like there are some examples in birds, I think belonging to the corvid species, corvid taxon, that they know that when they're hiding food and they are observed, that someone will likely steal their food and then they are going to hide it somewhere else. So by observing that and inferring about their cognitive, their vocal abilities, we know something about the cognitive world.
پس واقعا اونا در واقع دارن با هم صحبت میکنن و با استفاده از این مدیوم صوت، مدیوم صدا، پیامی رو بین همدیگه منتقل میکنن.
Yeah, and I think by studying the meaning or the function of vocalizations, let's say like that, we learn something about the cognitive world and how they perceive the world and how much they know. Yeah, and there, of course, are also studies about syntax. So in humans, we talk about phonological syntax and lexical syntax, right? And phonological syntax is just stringing together the meaningless phonemes into words. So it's meaningless units that are combined to a higher level. And then the lexical syntax is what gives language meaning. So we are combining, according to rules, we are combining words into phrases, into sentences, so on and so forth. And I think so far what we have found in animals is the phonological syntax level. So they really combine different units into larger ones. This is very much known for songbird, for example. They have often many distinct notes, people call them like notes or elements, and they combine it into motives, they repeat them and so on and so forth, and then they sing. And cetaceans sing as well, humpback whales. Bats actually also as well. Yes. They also sing. But I think one has to be careful, because although it is very complex in terms of different units and complexity of putting those units together, we really don't know if all single units mean something. Maybe it's just advertising, I'm a great male, I'm a great potential mate for you. Maybe it's just that. But I think it's also one of the challenges, but also one of the most fascinating things, actually, to try to find out what animals want to say. And besides observing in which context vocalizations happen, we can also play sounds back and see the reaction of the receivers, and then confirm sometimes, okay, this is really a territorial song, or this is an isolation call, or whatever. So, we know a lot. And I think it's often, we often tend to compare everything to humans, right?
Exactly.
We always want to see, there are similarities or there are differences, and it's so interesting because in humans it's similar or whatever. And sometimes I think it's just fascinating to study the communication system of an animal for its sake, because it's fascinating how many different communicative systems have evolved and how many things animals can do we can't. For example, like bats, which can echolocate and can see the world in complete dark and in another way. They see through their ears, and we couldn't do that.
Exactly.
Very, very few people can do that.
یه مشکلی که زمانی که ما همه اینها رو با رفتارها رو با انسان‌ها مقایسه می‌کنیم اینه که گاه‌گداری فراموش می‌کنیم که چقدر برخی از رفتارها در برخی از گونه‌ها توسعه یافته‌تر از اون چیزی هستش که ما در انسان‌ها می‌بینیم و گاه‌گداری ما در واقع فاقد برخی از این توانایی‌ها هستیم. ما راجع به خفاش‌ها صحبت کردیم. اینها موجوداتی هستن که در طول تاریخ خیلی بد فهمیده شدن و معمولاً ما اونها رو با هیولاها یا در واقع داستان‌های عجیب و غریبی نسبت میدیم، نگاه مثبتی بهشون نداریم، به خصوص اهلا که در دوران کووید هستیم و به خاطر نقشی که احتمالاً در منشأ اون داشتن دوچار در واقع نگاه منفی هستن از سوی جامعه. شما سالهای طولانیه که دارید با خفاشا کار میکنید و این موجودات بی‌نظیر، من میخواستم که از دید شما بپرسم که چرا به نظرتون این موجودات جذاب و قابل توجهی هستن و تا این حد در واقع موجودات شگفت‌انگیزی به شمار میرن؟
Yeah, so for me, they're, well, as I said before, fascinating because they perceive the world completely different than we do, right? They have this completely different view of the world. But besides that, I think they're fascinating because most of them are highly social animals. So they often live in stable groups for many, many years. They always interact with the same individuals, and it's fascinating to study the complexity of their social structures. They are long-lived, so many bats live for several years. So we have, last year someone told me that we found a European bat, by ringing them on the arms and then by recatching them. The oldest bat found was 42 years old, and it was a tiny bat. Yes, so like about 7-8 grams. So I think it's fascinating how long-lived they are, and that together with often those dynamics that they live in stable groups, or in Europe at least fusion. So they stay together in summer and then in winter in other groups. Gives us a huge variety of systems to study and to understand the causes and the proximate and ultimate causes of sociality also as well. And besides that, for me, I'm deeply interested in vocal communication, and there is this hypothesis that social complexity drives vocal complexity, because this all starts with the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis that the intelligence in primates was developed because they needed social competence, because they were living in stable groups, or they are living in stable groups, right? And they have to cooperate, but they have also to manipulate others. And for that, you need specific social cognitive skills. And with that along goes also the fact that when you live in a stable group and you interact repeatedly with the same individual, and you have to know hierarchies, for example, you know who is your ally or who is your enemy or whatever, you have to remember past interactions, then you need also vocal communication that mediates those interactions. And that's one of the theories or hypotheses that social complexity drives vocal complexity. And that's actually also what we studied in bats. And I think bats are fascinating for that because you have so many different species and you have the ability to have sometimes families of bats that live, all the species live in the same environment. So they face the same ecological pressures, right? And so knowing the phylogeny of the bats, you can rule out other factors and really see the impact of sociality on vocal complexity. And I think that's fascinating. And well, I have talked a lot about sociality and vocal communication because this interests me the most. But bats are also fascinating because we can learn so many other things from them, right? You know, for example, technology, the sonar, which is used in cars to park in, or that's based on bats, or sometimes research about medicine. So Desmodus rotundus, the vampire bat, they have a specific enzyme which prevents the blood from clotting. And this is used in medicine research, for example, because it's super interesting in cases of thrombosis and like that. So yeah, it's so fascinating. They are so fascinating. More than 1,400 species distributed in the entire world. And I think we can learn so many things from them.
و اونا تقریبا در همه جای دنیا غیر از 2 تا کلاهک قطبی زندگی میکنن.
Exactly.
و همه جا ما میتونیم پیداشون بکنیم.
Find them everywhere. That's also great.
و خفاش‌ها در واقع از گونه‌های مختلف روش‌های ارتباطی استفاده می‌کنن. ما در رابطه با بخش آکوستیک صحبت کردیم و بیشتر صحبت می‌کنیم. من زمانی که داشتم برای این مصاحبه می‌خوندم از جمله به مقاله‌ای از شما برخوردم که نوعی رفتارها یا ارتباطات رفتاری رو در واقع در خفاش‌ها بررسی می‌کرد. گونه دیگری از خفاش‌ها که اصطلاحاً در اون مقاله در تیترتون آورده بودین که در واقع نوعی رفتار بوکس مانند، بوکس بازی رو برای جلب توجه میت خودشون یا همسریابی خودشون استفاده میکنن و نوعی رفتار پرتنش یا تهاجمی رو برای نشون دادن توانایی خودشون بروز میدن. ما در رابطه با این طبقه بندی مختلف، طبقه بندی ارتباطات صوتی و ارتباطات رفتاری چقدر اطلاعات داریم و این اساساً این نوع طبقه بندی درست هست و اینکه چه اندازه درک شده در بین گونه‌های مختلف جانوری؟
So by behavior, it's probably what you mean is that they use visual signals. So they use, for example, a wing fling. Yeah. So I think often those two things go together because what many people don't know is that bats are actually also visual animals. They see well. Some species better than others. But often when they interact, they use multimodal signals. So they use communication along with behavioral displays. And I think, especially, for example, in this species which you mentioned, Carolia, which use this boxing and aggressive vocalizations, I think it's really both behavior and vocalizations are underlying each other because of course it's more impressive if you vocalize and then you flick your wings or whatever. Often these two things go together.
این شبیه همون چیزی است که ما تو انسان هم داریم دیگه. اکثر اوقات ما در واقع ارتباطات صوتیمون رو مثلا الان با ارتباطات رفتاری و یا اون چیزی که زبان بدن هست ترکیب میکنیم و بروز میدیم.
Exactly. It emphasizes more. I also like to talk with my hands when I talk. So it emphasizes more what you're saying, I think.
Okay. اجازه بدید به تحقیق اخیر شما برگردیم. شما در یک گونه خاصی از خفاش‌ها، گونه خفاش‌های بزرگ بال کیسه‌ای تحقیق کردید و متوجه شدید که نوزادهای اینها، توله خفاش‌ها، در واقع رفتاری مشابه انسان رو به کار میبرن. اون چیزی که به نام ادب کردن معروف هستش که در واقع با تقلید صدای والدین سعی میکنن که توانایی صوتی و مهارت صوتی خودشون رو توسعه بدن. ما چند تا گونه دیگر رو هم احتمالا میشناسیم که این رفتار رو و این نوع آموزش رو در واقع به کار میبرن. اگر ممکنه یه بیشتر راجع به این تحقیق به ما بگین و اینکه چرا این تحقیق اینقدر مهم هست و ما چه چیزهایی رو از مشاهده این رفتار در خفاش‌ها میتونیم یاد بگیریم.
Okay, maybe I start with answering the last part. So I think it's super interesting and important study because we show that two species that are phylogenetically so distant as humans and bats use the same mechanism to get to the same goal. So they use the same learning mechanism, this vocal practice behavior, to get to acquire a large vocal repertoire. In case of humans, it's speech. So there seems to be something which poses maybe an evolutionary constraint on how you have to learn something which is so complex in the end. And I think that's the fascinating thing. And yeah, well, I mean, our study started way back. It started with my supervisor, actually. So she was studying the territorial song, the song that actually pups learn through vocal imitation, during her thesis. And then she was sitting in front of the day roost, and then the baby bats were just producing sounds. And she immediately thought, like, this is like human babbling, human infant babbling. This is so fascinating. And then actually she wanted to study the babbling, but people were telling her it's really an potentially interesting behavior, but only if you can show that while they are babbling, they're actually learning through vocal imitation. Yes. Because this is the fascinating thing. Although we have animals that can do that, there are not so many that can vocally learn. So it is really fascinating. So she dedicated her thesis to studying the vocal imitation ability of that species, and she could actually show that pups do that. And years later, I joined her group and I was introduced to that Greater Sac Winged bat, and I had the same feeling. I was sitting in front of a day roost and the bats were they were babbling away in the day roost, and I was instantly thinking of, wow, this is really like an infant sitting in the corner and doing ma 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 ma, da da, you know, playing with sounds. And then of course, a feeling is not enough in science. So we started to read a lot of literature about the speech acquisition in infants. Actually, we talked to researchers, we had many discussions to understand really what is going on in infants. And then we came up with this list of features that define human infant babbling. And then we had something to compare our pup babbling with. And then we had this list and we knew, okay, we can now record pups during their entire ontogeny and then see if we can find the similar features or the same features in pup babbling. And that's what we did. And I think that's fascinating.
پس اگه من درست متوجه شده باشم این بودش که شما ابتدا به بررسی این رفتار ادب کردن یا قانون کردن در انسان ها پرداختین، در نوزاد انسان پرداختین، و از روی تحلیل اون به تعدادی از در واقع سرنخ‌ها یا اثر انگشت‌ها رسیدین. فکر می‌کنم که 5 مورد رو اشاره کرده بودید. 8 مورد ببخشید. 8 مورد رو اشاره کرده بودید که اینها در واقع سرنخ‌ها هستن، نقاط عطف هستن. بعد از اون صدای این خفاش‌ها رو ضبط کردید و به تحلیل اون پرداختید و به دنبال این المان‌ها و این در واقع نقاط اثر انگشت‌های مشخص در اون رفتار خفاش‌ها پرداختید که مشابه با اون چیزی که در انسان‌ها وجود داشت.
So maybe just as an example, so the most salient features, I think, are, for example, reduplication and rhythmicity. So what we find in both human infants and pups are that they replicate the syllables. So they produce the same syllable type. That would be an infant, but da, 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 and then they switch to the next one, da, 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 and pups do the same. It's a very rhythmic behavior. And also, like human infants, pups start to babble very early in their infancy, or in their ontogeny. So they stay with their moms for about 10 to 12 weeks. And after 2.5 weeks of age, they already start with babbling. And then they continue and throughout the entire ontogeny.
فوق‌العاده هیجان انگیزه. سوالی که من دارم اینه که آیا این رفتار صرفاً مختص به بخش در واقع ارتباطات صوتی عادی خفاش‌ها هست یا اینکه ما این رفتار رو در مورد سونار یا مکانیابی صوتی اونها هم می‌بینیم، یعنی اون مکانیابی صوتی رو هم اونها به همین روش یاد می‌گیرن یا نه این فقط بخصوص اون ارتباطات به نوعی صوتیشون هستش؟
Interestingly, no. So this particular species, they produce echolocation calls or sonar calls directly after birth, within hours after birth. And I actually measured those as well because I was curious, but they have almost the same duration. They have almost the same frequency. So there is no there is not a learning curve. So in many other bat species, we see that actually, that they produce, for example, so-called isolation calls. So the calls they produce to solicit care. And it happens that those isolation calls then transform into echolocation calls. This is true for many, many species, but Sarcopteryx, no. They're really, in babbling, it's only social vocal communication.
خب این شاید یه جورایی در واقع نشون بده که این رفتار متفاوت از این نظر که رفتاری ذاتی نیست که باهاش به دنیا بیان، رفتاری اکتسابیه که اون رو یاد میگیرن و توسعهش میدن.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, absolutely. I can just agree to that.
یکی از بخش‌های جذاب کاری که شما انجام دادین این بود که به محیط زیست اینها، محیط طبیعی خفاش‌ها رفتید و رفتار اونها رو از نزدیک مشاهده کردید، ضبط کردید. یکی از چیزایی که همیشه برای من تو این بررسی‌ها جذابه فعالیت‌های میدانی هستش که در واقع محقق به سراغ محیط زیست طبیعی گونه‌ها میره. اگر میشه یه مقدار در مورد این تجربه صحبت کنین، چگونه تجربه‌ای بود و اینکه بتونید این موجودات رو در محیط طبیعی خودشون و اونگونه که واقعا زندگی میکنن بررسی بکنید.
Well, for me, it's the greatest part of my work as a researcher that I really can go out to the wild and work with wild animals, you know. And I think our group has a very unique approach to work with bats because most people working with bats work in captivity, so they have them in captivity, or they follow them with tiny trackers which are mounted on animals, because of course bats are difficult to observe in the wild. But we have this species where we use this long-term, or we follow this long-term approach. So we really want to follow specific individuals over years, and we have always the same colonies we work with. And we take great care and time to habituate them to us. So every field season, we start with habituating them for 1-2 weeks. So sitting in front of their day roost, approaching every day a little bit closer, staying a little bit longer, so that in the end, when I'm 2 to 4 meters away from their day roost, they're completely okay with that. They just behave normally, and I can observe their behaviors and vocalizations in a completely natural and undisturbed setting. And I think this is amazing, because to understand complex behaviors like babbling and also vocal learning or other things, I think it's really, really important that you have the entire picture, that you get the picture in nature and you understand every variable which can play into that. And then, of course, once you have that, you can also take the bats to the lab and have controlled experiments, because you have the positive side that you can get rid of variables you don't want to interact with that. But I think in our case, this is the really fascinating thing, or the approach I like to work with wild animals, and to work long-term studies and long-term data and really understand how those individuals interact with each other. And so a day for me in the jungle is basically to get up before the sun rises. And then I pack my things, my ultrasonic microphone and my laptop and everything. And then I walk to the forest, to the tree, because those species like to roost in tree crevices, or also they are also cultural followers. So they also like to stay on the walls of buildings. And then I go to the colony I work with and I settle my equipment, and then I stay until the sun sets. And I'm just sitting there in front of the bats and I'm recording them. I'm taking notes from their behaviors. I'm having a video camera filming the behaviors. Yeah, and that I do for 3 to 4 months until the pups are weaned and actually are dispersing from the natal roost. Yeah.
پس تمام این ضبط‌ها در واقع تو این چند ماه صورت گرفت و بعد شما نتایج رو برگردوندین و تحلیل نهاییشو در آزمایشگاه انجام دادین.
Yeah, it was this is also really amazing that you can really see a pup developing from the day it's born until the day it's subadult and mom says, so now it's enough. Now you're adult. And yeah, exactly. Females have to disperse and the males stay. And I think what you have to know maybe about our species, and maybe what people don't know, is that they are very unique in the way they roost. So they do not roost together in clumps like most bats do, right? So they roost with an inter-individual distance between each other. So you have an adult individual, another adult individual, another one, and they maintain this inter-individual distance. So they don't like to be so close. And only the pups are allowed to ignore this distance. And as I said before, this behavior, babbling, and all the social interactions like mating, courtship, they occur during the day, in the day roost. And they are very light tolerant. So, I mean, when you are roosting on a wall of a building, then obviously you are not scared of having daylight. So I can really see the bats very close, and I can see when they start vocalizing. We usually capture the adult bats once in their lifetime, and we ring them with individual plastic rings on their forearms, so they're individually banded. And then, of course, we release them, and then we can really tell the individuals apart. And mothers only interact and feed their own pup. So I can, through the mom, I can identify the different pups. So I can really make focal individual recordings and observations, and that really helps our work, of course.
یه نکته دیگه اینجا اینه که آیا این رفتاری که ما در این خفاش‌های در واقع بزرگ بالکیسه‌ای دیدیم، آیا این رفتار مختص این گونه است یا اینکه در گونه‌های دیگه هم گونه‌های دیگه خفاش هم مشاهده شده، یا اینکه اساساً الان فعلا نمیدونیم که آیا این رفتار در گونه‌های دیگه هم هست یا نه؟
Yeah, that's a point. We don't know yet. So far, we don't have we don't have proof of another species that babbles. There are other bat species that are able to learn the vocalization. So what happens, what we observed a lot, is that in many other bat species, they can modify their vocalizations based on the social input they get. So they have, for example, innate vocalizations, and then they can shift towards group mean or whatever. But yeah, so far Sarcopteryx is the only one which is really combining this vocal imitation and babbling during ontogeny. But I'm completely sure that we are going to find other species in bats that babble. Yeah, I'm completely sure. Yeah, and I think also those vocal learning bat species that are out there, there are potentially candidates to look into that.
یه نکته خیلی جذابی که داشتین صحبت می‌کردیم، من بهش فکر می‌کردم، این بودش که این رفتار رو که ما می‌بینیم به نوعی این روش یادگیری با تقلید کردن و این ادبته کردن، با این کار اونها در واقع دارن یه سری انگار مسیرهای تازه یا ساختارهای عصب شناختی تازه رو در ذهن خودشون و در مغز خودشون توسعه میدن و میسازن. ما راجع به توانایی‌های شناختی اونها و توسعه اون صحبت کردیم. چقدر ما در رابطه با این توسعه عصب شناختی و در واقع این مسیرهای تازه که در مغزشون میسازن به کمک این روش اطلاعات داریم و چه مقدار در واقع از این نظر مورد بررسی قرار گرفتن؟
Yeah, that's also a super interesting point, and right now I started a new project as a postdoc, and I'm looking into that. So I want to know what are the neuromolecular foundations of vocal learning and what is going to happen. And so far I cannot tell you anything because it's work in progress, but we are looking into that. Yeah.
به نظرم شما سوال بعدی من رو هم به نوعی جواب دادین. من می‌خواستم بپرسم که در واقع قدم بعدی این تحقیقات چی است. بنابراین شما به بررسی این رفتار از زاویه و چشم‌انداز عصب شناخته خواهید
پرداخت. Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the things I'm interested in because this babbling really pinpoints the time when vocal learning is taking place, and this is really helpful in neuromolecular studies, because you can really know what when a behavior takes place and then see what happens in the brain. That's one part. And the other part, I'm really interested in the social influences, how they shape the babbling and the learning success and learning speed. So I'm interested in the interactions between mom and pop, how they influence that, because we know from humans, we know from songbirds, also common marmosets, for example, that interactions between parents and infants matter and really influence the vocal ontogeny. And that's the next thing also that I want to have a closer look at.
من میدونم شما وقتتون خیلی کمه، اما قبل از اینکه در واقع خداحافظی کنم، اگر فکر میکنید که نکته‌ای هست که جا مونده تو سوالای من و مهمه راجع به این تحقیق که راجع بهش صحبت کنیم، ممنون میشم با مخاطبانمون در میون بذارید.
No, I think we pretty much got it covered. So, yeah.
خیلی ممنون که این اطلاعات رو با ما در واقع به اشتراک گذاشتین. واقعا فوق‌العاده است این که میدونین کار کردن با حیواناتی مثل خفاش ها و کاری که شما انجام میدین به ما کمک میکنه که یه درک و دید بهتری نسبت به حیات وحش اطرافمون داشته باشیم و اینکه در چه دنیای شگفت انگیزی زندگی میکنیم. واقعا ممنونم بابت این هم مصاحبه هم
Yeah. Thank you. No, I think maybe a last word. If you happen to see a bat in your garden, then just be happy because it's an amazing creature. It's eating the insects that are going to sting you. So, yeah, I think people should be happy.
Don't afraid of the
grateful.
bats. These are great animals.
Exactly. When they see a bat flying around, and maybe you can start to listen to them and observe their behavior. So, yeah.
خیلی ممنون دکتر فرناندز از وقتی که در اختیار ما گذاشتین. فوق‌العاده بود. ممنون ازتون.
Yeah, me too. And it was really amazing to talk to you. It was a very nice conversation. It was great questions. So it was a pleasure for me too.
ممنون از اینکه این اپیزود در این شب‌ها رو تماشا کردید و ممنون از دکتر فرناندز که وقتشون رو در اختیار ما قرار دادن. ما همچنان در میانه پاندمی هستیم. لطفاً تمام اون توصیه‌های ایمنی رو رعایت کنید. اگر نوبت واکسنتون شد حتما واکسن بزنید و مراقب باشید و سعی کنیم که این زنجیره رو بشکنیم تا هر چه زودتر در واقع از این وضعیت خارج بشیم. تا هفته آینده روز و روزگارتون خوش باشه.